there's been a slight change in schedule. Aaron Pierce got stuck in Waxahachie in trial. He's still on direct examination. Mark Griffith put him on the stand. Has put him on the stand this morning. So Matt is going to do Aaron's presentation as well as his own presentation, and I think that will go well. You'll get all the information, and Aaron's PowerPoint will be in the Dropbox, and we'll even give you a cell phone number if you want, so you can call him and ask questions. Our next speaker is Matt Farrar. Matt, I met maybe a decade ago at a TCDLA seminar. He was talking about something, and he and I started talking, and he's become my go-to psychologist. That I've used him in all sorts of types of writs, in trial. What I've loved about Matt when he writes a report is he'll tell me what his opinion is. He'll tell me the factual basis of the opinion, and then he'll cite to the authority, the scientific literature that supports his opinion, and he'll discuss it. And then behind his article, his report to me, he'll have the literature that supports every one of his opinions. So I have the peer-reviewed studies all ready to go, and he's thorough and complete. In the realm of sex offender registration, he created the protocol for the risk assessment for deregistration. And he's one of the people that pushed deregistration through the legislature. And on top of that, he has trained all of the 20 certified risk assessment providers in the state. He's the trainer for them. So he is the go-to guy on risk assessments, what it means, the procedures, what it means, what the tests mean, and why we do what we do to get the risk assessments. So, Matt Farrar.
It's all downhill from here. After one of Stan's introductions, can I go? No, I can't leave. I do want to give credit where credit's due. Council did ask me to respond to Chapter 62.4, which was come up with a risk assessment device. That's a big job. I didn't do that by myself. Mark Stafford, he's most recently the Dean of Criminal Justice down at Texas State. Yes, Mike. I'm speaking into my lapel mic. Thanks for reminding me. So, for those of you who didn't hear, Mark Stafford was the head of the sociology department at UT. Moved down to Texas State, was the Dean of Criminal Justice down there. He and I did the research that came up with the methodology, and then Stan's right. After that, Mark made me do the rest of it, to be quite frank. So I guess I get credit, but I also feel wore out a little bit. But yeah, Mark Stafford was very, very, very instrumental. So my topic is the risk assessment portion of what you need to know about registration. For my presentation, I'm going to talk about 5 different areas. I'm going to talk about the effectiveness of registration. I'm going to talk about what deregistration is not. We haven't covered that yet. And then the main part of what I'm talking about is the risk assessment criteria for deregistration, the risk assessment instruments, and then finally I'll talk a little bit about the specialists and the reports themselves. The question hasn't been addressed today, but it's a fundamental question. Does registration work? There's only one reason we started registration. We wanted to keep our children safe. We wanted to keep the public safe, right? And there was no way to research it before we implemented it. We started out with a really good idea. Let's keep the community safe. It was implemented, and then we start studying it. And there is, what's the right way of saying it? There's consistent research about the outcome of it. Let's talk about, I'm going to give you a quick chronology of it. Let's start with a fairly early study in 1995 by Schramm and Malloy. They looked at 125 registrants on supervision at the highest level of notification. They looked at 90 sex offenders not on registration because this was early on and some of the offenders were not required to be on registration. What's the outcome that they found? There was, in a 1 to 4 year follow-up, no difference in recidivism, no difference in reoffense rates. Jump ahead about 5 years, and there's a lot of research in between. I'm just kind of giving you a chronology. Atkins and Huff and Strawberger did a study where they followed 223 registered sex offenders, 201 unregistered sex offenders. 7 from each group had a new offense. So what's the impact of registration supposed to be? It's supposed to keep it safer. This is going to sound funny to you, but I think that if registration was really working, you'd catch more, right? And we're not seeing that yet. I'm going to talk about this research in terms of cancer treatment. In this study, the researchers followed registrants in 10 different states. And they wanted to know if registration had any impact at all. And I kind of couch this in terms of, would you go for this kind of cancer treatment? If your doctor told you, out of every 10 people, or in this case 5 states, or out of every 10 states, there was no change. We implement registration, there's no change in 5 of the states. In 2 of the states, the sexual assaults increased. In 2 of the states, assaults didn't change. In 3 states, sexual assaults went down. That's such a mixed result. It's hard to imagine that if you had a loved one who needed treatment, that you would say, yes, give me a treatment that may not work half the time and does opposite things the other part of the time. So there's really just no systematic effect for that. In this case, Wisconsin did a study of its registrants, and it found that of 47 high-risk registered offenders compared to 166 high-risk not registered offenders, the ones on the registry had a higher reoffense rate. It looks like it was about 19% as opposed to 12%. And I don't know if that's working or not working. Are you not following that? The red bar is people who are on the registry. They're reoffending at a higher rate. You could argue the registry is working, right? Because it's catching them. But isn't the registry supposed to also stop them? It's hard to say. Let me go back. Let me just talk about that just for one more second. In general, I expect registrants to actually have more problems because of the research. And if this study is any indication, I think the reason that they might have problems is the difficulties that the registry causes them. And there's research on that as well. Levinson has done a lot of research on what happens to registrants once they're on the registry. She did this study in Florida and Indiana and Connecticut. She's replicated this study many, many times. And she asked the registrants, how many of you lost a job as a result of being on the registry? 20%. In Florida, 10% in Indiana and Connecticut. How many of you were made to move, either by landlord or neighbor? Considerable amount. Now I want you to look at this slightly differently. We can keep going through this, but now I want you to look at this a little bit differently. What are the standard conditions of probation in Texas for most counties? Do they say things like have stable employment? Yeah. Do they tell you to have a stable living place? Okay. What the registry does is we know what it takes to make a probation or a parolee a success, and what we know is registration undermines that. The fact that there are not more registrants reoffending is somewhat surprising to me. But I think there's an explanation for that. Do you want to go for the explanation? The explanation is that only about 30% of sex offenders have prior non-sex offenses. So I don't think they're criminally oriented. They could be deviant, they could have personality disorders, they could be, weak-minded, if you will, but they're not criminal by nature. And so when you put them under pressure, I think most of them just continue to get crushed. That's why we're not seeing as high of a recidivism rate. Property damage, this is interesting. Threaten or harass, 33% of them. 21% get physically injured. Part of our standard conditions of probation say stay away from people who will be a bad influence on you. Well, getting beat up sounds like a bad influence. So it's very, very challenging to be on the registry. Here's probably the worst part of the research at all. Registration hurts the registrant's family and friends. 67% of the family members have some form of harm. That's very broad by Zavetis. 42% of the family members are threatened or harassed. That's an unintended negative consequence of the registry. 20% of families experience property damage, and 7% of family or friends of residents, not the registrants themselves, 7% of them experience physical assault. I don't think that's what the registry was intended to do, and that's probably two things about the Texas legislature. They're not going to do anything to make you unsafe. So when they passed deregistration, their intention wasn't to make our communities less safe. The other thing is, I don't think they don't do nice things for sex offenders. I mean, most of the legislation actually ends up curtailing them more and more. I think you're looking at the slide, you're looking at the information that was part of what prompted the legislature to look at deregistration, because it's harming a lot of people, innocent people, who were never convicted of a crime. So registration doesn't reduce recidivism. I gave you just 3 samples of research, well actually 4 if you count the Wisconsin study. There's literally hundreds of studies on the registry and whether or not it's associated with reduced reoffense. It is not. You can find 1 or 2 studies out there who say it is associated with making the community safer, but when you go in there and you look at those studies, what you're finding is methodologically or some other way they're wrong. This is one of those cases where the research is just completely consistent. Registration does not reduce reoffense rates. Registration does increase risk factors for reoffense, and registration hurts other citizens who were never convicted of a crime. So for those reasons, I think that's why we got into deregistration itself. When we talk about deregistration, it's important to talk about what deregistration is not. If an individual is able to deregister, it doesn't remove them from any non-public law enforcement registries. So if there's a DNA registry, it doesn't do anything to the DNA registry. It doesn't do anything to fingerprint registries. It's the third item there, it's not the basis for an appeal of their original offense. It's not the basis for an expungement of an offense. It doesn't affect probation or parole. This has been talked about a little bit already. But the day that an individual is put on a registry, the day they're sentenced, is actually the day that they're eligible to file for deregistration. That would be really stupid if you tried that. The judge just sentenced you. He's not going to look next day, see you in court and want to deregister you. That's just not going to happen. And in fact, most judges will be wise enough to know that they want to see the individual finish their term of supervision. So even it doesn't affect probation or parole status at all. Even if they were able to deregister, I can't fathom it. Even if they were able to deregister while they're on supervision, they would still have to finish supervision. It has no impact on them. If they deregister, they will still have the criminal record that they have. Deregistration does not change their criminal history for DPS, NCIC, TCIC. And finally, they're still not eligible to work with children. If the hiring powers do their job and they pull criminal history, they're going to see the offense, they're not going to hire this person. So there's a lot more things that what deregistration is not, but these are the most important things. I think Scott Merchant earlier today had this up here, 62.403. Actually, you had the whole thing up, didn't you, at various times? Yeah, this is one of the things he covered. This was when Mark Stafford and I were looking at developing the risk assessment methodology. This was the driving force, because this is what the legislature told the Council on Sex Offender Treatment they needed to do. And if you hear me say CSOT, that just means Council on Sex Offender Treatment. If you look at it, the Section A is the council will develop a risk assessment tool or adopt one. Here's your foreshadowing. We didn't develop it, we adopted. But take a look at items 1 and 2 there. This was, I was really happy to see this, but it also I had to wrap my head around it too, because look at item 1. It says, item 1 says, whatever tool CSOT develops, it's going to have to take a look at criminal history, okay? And then number 2, we're going to seek to predict 2 things. The first thing is the occurrence of another or a subsequent reportable adjudication or conviction. In terms of the language, I'm just break it down into plain English, that means a new sex offense, okay? And then the second thing, are they a continuing danger, if any, to the community? And you see, they didn't just focus on, is this person going to commit a new sex offense, did they? The legislature said, we want you, when you're doing this risk assessment, to identify, will they have a new sex offense? Yes. But any other danger that they might pose to the community. So the risk assessment tool that was ultimately adopted addressed those elements of the Code of Criminal Procedure. There's actually 3 risk assessments that are used when a deregistration evaluation is done. Every deregistration evaluation will have 3 risk assessments. There'll be a sexual risk assessment, a general risk assessment, and then an assessment for severe or chronic criminality. On sexual risk assessment, the evaluators will choose between one of 2 different sexual risk assessments. The Static 2002, which is really our preferred one, but the coding rules for the Static 2002 say you cannot use that if an individual's only offense is child pornography. There's another tool called the Matrix 2000. You can use the Matrix 2000 with hands-on offenses like indecency with a child by contact, but it's also approved for if anybody just had their only offense is child pornography. So if a registrant's only offense is child pornography, the evaluator is going to use the matrix 2000. Otherwise, we stick with a static 2002. The assessment for general criminality is the level of service inventory revised. And you might hear me call that the LSIR. And then finally, the last thing we're looking for, severe or chronic criminality, is the hair psychopathy checklist revised. Our feeling was, yes?
Why is that with regard to the child pornography?
I think the explanation that the authors of the test have given is that they didn't have enough child pornographers in the standardizing sample for the static 2002 or the static 99. And because they lack, and I forgot to do this, her question was, why can't you use static 2002 with people with child pornography only? My response is, the authors have said they didn't have enough child pornographers in the standardizing sample. Okay. So the risk assessment, there's another thing you have to understand about the risk instruments. They're used to make some decisions about who's eligible to deregister and who's not. The council looked towards the national standards and in particular the Association for Treatment of Sexual Abusers. And what in 1996, the ATSA opined that notification, meaning being on the registry, should be for those offenders who are the highest risk only. And that's the standard that CSOT adopted. Let's go back to the actual risk assessment tools. And let me make this kind of a real moment and just say, let's say I'm doing a deregistration evaluation on one of your clients. Then I'm looking at them. The first thing I'm going to do when I'm done is I'm going to score these up. If all of his risk assessments fall below the high category, then I will list, my conclusion will be he meets the risk assessment criteria for deregistration. Okay? So look at the static 2002. If he has a score below 9, he meets the risk assessment criteria. He can have a medium score or a low score. And just for a point of clarification, if I did the static, I'm not going to do the matrix, right? Because we only do one of the sexual risk assessments. If the individual has a score less than 16, I'm going to say he meets that risk assessment criteria for deregistration. And then finally on the PCLR, the hair psychopathy checklist, a score of 30 or less, he meets the risk assessment criteria. So that the risk assessment numbers tell me what I'm going to put in my report, because that's the criteria that CSOT established, and that's what they need to know. I want to talk a little bit about each of the risk assessment instruments. This might be drilling way down. Yes?
Do they have to be below all categories?
They have to be below high in all categories.
So if there's one where he's high, then it's
He's out.
okay.
Yeah. He can be medium in all. He can be low in all. He can be medium in 2, low in 1. He can be medium in 1 and low in 2. But if he has any high, then he's out.
Is the length of time between the offense and the testing a factor in whether they're high risk or not? Because there's discussion earlier about the file, whether the person would be on probation or wait.
Well, always wait. Don't put your judge in that position. You should like your judges, not put them in the crosshairs. You should always wait, but waiting doesn't make any difference, because sometimes it's irritating to me, and some of you may have heard me testify, like on the LSIR, if the person had an alcohol problem at any point in their life, let's say it's 30 years ago, and now they're the head of the local AA chapter and they haven't drank in 30 years, I still got to count that against them. So how long you wait won't make any difference. The static 2002 is the younger brother of the static 99. It's developed by the same folks. It solves certain problems that the static 99 had. I can tell you the most important problem it solved. You can score the static 2002 exclusively off criminal history. I can tell you that's influenced me greatly, because if you listen to what I'm saying, when I score the static 2002, I don't have to listen to a word the registrant tells me. I just go straight to the criminal history, and that's very, very powerful. You know, can the registrant come in and blow smoke? Yeah, that won't affect this score. Can the registrant come to me and do an evaluation, learn what I'm asking him, then go to another evaluator? Yeah, that can happen, but it's not going to change his score. All 20, I think there's 21 of us right now, know how to score the static. We're not going to listen to what he's saying. We're going to go straight to the criminal history. Yes? I'll show you that in a second. It's not subjective. No, you'll see. I want to show you that just so you get a feel for it. You know, Scott Merchant, sorry. Sometimes if you know someone on a first name basis, you don't finish the word. So Scott Merchant mentioned earlier today that a requirement that CSOT has is fingerprint criminal histories. The deregistration evaluators request and don't finish the report until they get the fingerprint FBI criminal history and the DPS criminal history. So we're looking at, I think, reliable data. And in response to your question, let's take a look at some of the items, let's take a look at all the items. These are the first half. There's 14 items on the static 2002. You're looking at the first 7. And you'll see there's special rules that how you define each of these items. But the flip side is, once again, you can get all this off criminal history. First you get the age. The age is actually on criminal history, date of birth. I usually go with the most, if there's 2 dates of births, because they have AKAs running around, or otherwise known as, they generally resolve that. I haven't seen that in deregistration evaluations. I've seen it in some other criminal cases I'm working in where someone has 2 dates of birth. I just use the youngest date of birth because that will give them more points. And then you get the second section, past age, is persistence of sexual offending. Prior sentencing occasion for a sexual offense. That's not subjective, is it? If it's honest criminal history, I'm going to count it. Any juvenile arrests in a sexual offense convicted, we get information about juvenile offenses. That might be the one that's most questionable to me. Rate of sexual offending, if the person has 2 sexual offenses, you divide 2 into how old they are, and if they're 28, then the average is 14. Okay, then he gets a point because he's committing a sexual offense sooner than once every 15 years. If he has 2 sexual offenses and he's 45 years old, or let's say 44 for ease of math, then the number is 22. He wouldn't get a point on that. But let me back up. You heard earlier today that if he has 2 offenses, he's not going to get approved anyway. So I don't anticipate item number 4 will ever be triggered in a deregistration evaluation. Deviant sexual interest. This seems to be the one that causes the most confusion if you're not familiar with the research. So let me just say a few quick things about that. You see where it says any sentencing occasion for a non-contact sex offense. And you know, what's a non-contact sex offense?
Child porn.
Child porn is. Indecent exposure, yeah. Peeping Tom activity, I don't get many of those anymore. But those are them. Why is that a risk factor? Remember, this is a recipe for you're creating the likelihood that someone's going to commit a new sex offense, and you're including this component in there. Why are you including it? Don't answer it. That's an unfair question to you. That's just a rhetorical question. Why it is included is that hands-off offenses can occur at a very high rate. Someone's going to go driving down the road to expose. How many people could they potentially expose to? More than one. You know, if you have a hands-on offense, be it a rape or a child molesting, you're probably having one victim for that day or for a long time. An exposer, 6 or 8 victims in one afternoon. That's why the non-contact offenses, just because you can be more productive. Any male victims. So the research is really, really clear. If you have an adult male who is molesting male children, and those children don't live in the home with him, for instance, the Boy Scout leader, the social worker at the hospital, those kind of things, they can have anywhere from 10 to 20 times more victims than other types of child molesters. So that's why you get concerned about those. That's why that's a risk factor. And then 2 children, both under 12, at least one unrelated. Obviously, I mean, just that's repeat behavior. And he's I think of incest perpetrators as being low risk for a lot of different reasons, one of which is they don't dare do it outside the home. They have a constraint on that. But if you have someone who's doing it in the home and outside the home, that's a risk factor. Sure. I have no wiggle room. I'm still, so you've heard the attorneys talk before about this is the law, we're going to stick to it. I've got coding rules. I stick to my coding rules. The research I just cited, and his question was, what if you have a female offender with a male victim? I still have to count it. Now, the research doesn't apply to females selecting male victims, but they didn't give me an exclusion in the rules, so I'm going to count it.
Put a caveat in the report.
Do I do what? Caveat?
Yeah. Say this person has a 4. Making a medium risk. The woman has 4, make it a medium risk. They take that one away, be a 3.
Yeah. I would not. No, I wouldn't.
Say I had to the point because of this.
I mean, I've done things like that before. I've never done that before.
Why doesn't it say female?
Because it's not associated with higher risk. Remember, this is an actuarial risk assessment device. They looked at the research, they identified what the risk factors are, they put them up there. That's not, having a female victim is not a risk factor. Having male victims is. Very, very little. They're trying to do it, but very, very little. Okay, the last 7 items. Relationship to victims. Any unrelated victims, once again, incest perpetrators are really low risk. That's not to minimize the harm they cause, but this is a risk assessment instrument, so we're just looking at risk. They're low risk. Stranger victims, very, very rare to have a stranger victim. I think it's 1% or less of sex offenders have stranger victims. Strangers defined in the risk assessment instruments as the victim and the perpetrator did not know themselves for more than 24 hours before the offense occurred. So it's a real specific definition. And then here's general criminality. Remember, one of the things that in 62.4 was talking about was the legislature wanted CSOT to consider criminal history. Well, here's 5 items on criminal history. You get a point if you have any prior involvement, and when I'm scoring it, if they have a MIP, minor in possession, I'll count that against them. So any kind of involvement at all. And you can see they do the numeric breakdowns here, less than 3, they would not get an extra point, but on item 11, if you have 3 to 13, you'd get 1 point. If you have more than 13 prior occasions, which I've never seen, then they would get 2 points. Community supervision violations, you get a point. And then this is a hard one, but basically you have to be anywhere from 3 to 4 months, 3 to 4 years past your last offense before you get your sex offense. Final one, there is any non-sexual violent sentencing occasions, so that would be assault, domestic violence, any kind of injury to a child. No, I don't count traffic. I count driving without a license and driving without insurance because that can end up on a criminal record. But speeding I don't count. I might have more than 13. So I would absolutely count juvenile, yes. Any. I would count any. That has to be factored in, yes. Right. Yes. Like runaway? Yeah, I would count that against them. And when I say I count that against them, all the deregistration evaluation specialists would count that against them because we're all trained to do it the same way.
Is there a template that we could use as a tool to pre-assess our client?
Yeah.
Because I use a similar template to assess recidivism risk for prisoners
Right.
coming up for parole.
Right.
Sure.
Go to static99.org and the Static 99, the Static 99R, the 2002 and the 2002R are all on that particular website.
But you don't have a template in the materials.
I don't have a template in materials, but there'll be lots of templates at that website.
They're out there.
Yes. Okay. So meeting the criteria that the legislature set forth was important, but these end up in court. So one of the other things we wanted to do, and we checked out before we adopted a risk assessment instrument, is does the risk assessment instrument meet Daubert? Because obviously there's going to be a petition to the court. The court may have a hearing. The court should not have to listen to any testimony by any expert on things that would not pass Daubert. So we made sure that we looked at the 4 criteria of Daubert, and I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to talk about this with all the instruments, maybe spend a little bit more time on the static just so you get what I'm kind of the model or the template I'm using. Has the risk assessment instrument been tested? I will tell you that when I think a risk assessment instrument's been tested is if the author of the test did testing before he released it. If he's releasing something to the public and he hasn't tested it, I think that's pretty irresponsible. In this case, you had almost 4,500 subjects in it that the authors used to test this. How many, when you get those national polls, when presidential elections, remember those? Our national poll says within 2 or 3%. How many people do you think they're assessing? Huh? It's 1,000. Yeah. So, and you can get within 2 to 3% accuracy. So what I want to see now this isn't all the research that has been done on the Static 2002. This is what the author did initially, okay? And I like to see close to 1,000 in the studies. And we certainly have that with the authors who did the Static 2002. So has it been tested? I think the authors did a good job of testing it before it came out. In 2009, when I was looking at the second question, has the instrument been peer reviewed? I actually stopped. I found 20 studies where they studied the reliability, validity, and accuracy of it. And after I got to 20 studies, I said, I think we have enough to say that it's been peer reviewed. What's the known error rate? So these statistics aren't talking about error as much as they're talking about accuracy. Do you see where it says, the normative sample for the Static 2002, the authors found that it had an AUC, area under the curve statistic, of 71.716. And translate that into English, 71.6% of the time it accurately classifies somebody as a risk or not a risk. Okay? Hip x-rays, how accurate are those? In the emergency room, they're about 71% accurate, 74% accurate. Pregnancy tests you get at Walgreens, how accurate are those? Not very. Okay. Do you still use x-rays? Would you still get a blood test if it's not 100%? And the answer is yes, you would. This is just a tool that you can use to make decisions, and it's more accurate than guessing. If you are guessing, you multiply, 50-50 times the base rate, and you learn that your accuracy, if you're just guessing, is about 5% to 10%. So this is a vast improvement over just guessing. I included here, I could have included a lot of other studies. You see where it says the Langdon study has area under the curve of 0.71, which is really close to what they found in the normative sample. Rather consistently, we're getting 71% accuracy. And then the last criterion for the Daubert standard is to what extent is it accepted, and the Static 2002 is used in US, Canada, Europe, and Asia. In Texas, if you talk with LSOTPs, licensed sex offender treatment providers, widely used. Any questions about the static? We're going to go to the matrix. Yes? Recidivism. So what they do is they get a number and they basically say he's a low risk, he's got a score of 0, let's say. He's not going to recidivate. And let's say none of them recidivate. Okay. On the other hand, he has a score of 8. He's a high risk. And everybody with the 8s will recidivate. And now that's a vast oversimplification, because what they actually do is they plot all scores and group all the people with all the different scores and then plot the recidivism rate for each score. And then you develop an overall number for that. Are you asking, is it prospective or retrospective? So some studies are retrospective and some studies are prospective. They have essentially the same area under the curve statistic, though. Yes. Different researchers will count arrests, and some won't, some will. Some researchers will account only convictions. If you get a technical violation, some researchers count that, some don't. So there's some confusion about what constitutes conviction, but everybody counts a reoffense as recidivism. By some researchers, yes. A technical violation that results in a sanction, like an administrative hearing, they might call that That's rare, but I've seen that. You know, and I think it's important to also talk about, I get this question about this quite a bit. I don't know what to do with it, but some people say, well, isn't it true that a lot of sex offenses are not reported? And the answer to that is yes. And, you know, pulling back the curtain on that question, it's really easy to see where that's coming from. The person who asked that question is concerned for potential victims, concerned about victims that may have not have been discovered, and you have to respect that. On the other hand, as a researcher, you have to ask, if you ask that about one offense, you have to ask that about all offenses. And when you do that and you look in the research, what you're going to find out is sex offenses are not the most underreported offenses that are out there. There's good research, for instance, that shows DWI offenses are detected about 1 in every 500. Okay, that may not sound. I don't know how that comes across, but right now we can only estimate how many sex offenses are not discovered. The largest number I've heard is the one I want to give to you right now, 101. So for every 100 you detect one. That's the largest number I've seen. There's lots of other offenses that get unreported at a greater rate than that. So I think the underreporting is something that affects all of the studies, not just sex offenses. Matrix 2000, we're going to start speeding up because now you see what my template, we're going to start, you saw how I handled the static 2002. We'll speed up a little bit. The Matrix 2000 has 7 items. You're looking at the first 3. Data test. And the reason it's data test is we want to know what their risk is right now. If someone's 18 to 24 right now, the research says that's the most productive years for a criminal. If someone's a criminal, they're going to commit most of their crimes 18 to 24. So you get 2 points for that if you're 18 right now. If the offender was 18 when he committed his crime and now he's 60, he's not getting 2 points. He's getting 0 points because he's over age 35. Appearances for sexual offenses, you can see the more you have, the more points you get. On this, the matrix is structured a little funny. If you have 0 points on all 3 of these factors, you're considered low risk. If you get 1 point, you're medium. And I'm trying to recall off the top of my head I think it's 2 points gets you into the high risk area. So those are the first 3. Here are the last 4 items on the Matrix 2000. Male victim, we talked about that already, right? Stranger victim, same definition, didn't know him for 24 hours in advance, single, never in a married relationship, and a non-contact sexual offense. There's a scoring peculiarity with the matrix that you need to be aware of. These items, male victim, stranger victim, apply to actual persons that the offenders come in contact with. You can't score these if their only offense is child pornography. Okay? I'm going to back up one slide and say criminal history. You can take a look at this. Once again, you're seeing the role that criminal history plays. You're also seeing that it's fairly objective. You just count them up and you know what the score is. On this part of the Matrix 2000, everything but single, never in a married relationship can be scored off of the criminal history. At this point, I don't think marriage has become a crime, so we won't necessarily find that on on the criminal history. But 6 of the 7 items can be scored off criminal history. Has the Matrix 2000 been tested? In this case, Thornton's the author. He almost got to almost got to 1,000, but pretty close, 900 or 800 and something. But yes, he tested it before he released it. Has it been peer reviewed? In 2009, when I was counting, I easily found 10 other published studies that addressed, and I'll be specific, that had to address the reliability and validity. There were statistical analyses of it, whether it was reliable. What's the known error rate? There was a low of 0.68. I included that study because it was below 0.7. All the others are 0.7 and up, but you can see the last bullet point, Thornton found an area under the curve of 0.75, so 0.77, the one above that. So it really varies, probably in the low 70s is what most of them, in terms of accuracy, 77% accuracy. Yeah, area under the curve. It's a statistic that basically works like this. If you get you pull two randomly selected people out of your pool, the one with the higher score is going to reoffend. So it's basically testing that. The extent of general acceptance, it's actually, I can't remember exactly what David Thornton said. He's the author of the tool, but it's apparently used in the police departments all throughout the United Kingdom as their risk assessment instrument as to how they handle their cases. But it's also used, right now it's the only one that's licensed sex offender treatment providers are using in Texas if the only offense is child pornography. So remember, you were an individual, we're only going to use a static or a matrix. So once we have the sexual reoffense assessment done, then we have to go on to the general reoffense assessment. That's what the level of service inventory measures. There's 54 items. Not going to display all 54. The 54 items are divided into 10 categories. You can see the categories up there. Once again, remember what the legislature asked CSOT to do, to consider criminal history. Well, that's the first set of items on the LSIR. And the rest of the items, once again, think about your standard conditions of supervision. What is it that you want your probationers, parolees to do? Well, you want them to have good education and good employment. Well, if they don't, they get points on the LSIR for that. Is that a problem? Yeah, yeah. So I can tell you, I mean, I've probably done, I think I've done 60 or so deregistration evaluations, and a lot of them pass. The ones that stand out that don't pass are because of the LSIR. I had one guy very, very clearly, he was living in his parents', I want to say basement because that's such a stereotype, but he's living in his parents' house, plays video games all day, doesn't work, and you know, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you're not going to get approved. And sure enough, he got too many points. He had a drug problem at one point, an alcohol problem. He's isolated. The friends he does hang out with have committed crimes. I mean, he was way high. And afterwards, his attorney calls and says, well, is there anything he can do to change those scores? And my response was, get a life. I mean, he just didn't have a life, and that counts against you. So once again, real quick on the Daubert criterion. One here, has it been tested? Oh my God. LSIR has been tested. It started in 1970. It's been tested and tested and tested. It was revised in 95. There are hundreds of studies, and the authors of this test did most of them early on. Has been peer-reviewed, hundreds. It's used in US, Canada. It's used in Europe and Asia. And that's how you turn off a computer. That's how you turn them back on. Level of service inventory. Here's one of the statistics really, really important to me. Do you see that top one? False negative rate for LSIR for low-risk offenders is 2 to 3%. What does that mean conversely? Conversely, it means the true positive, meaning somebody who's truly not a risk, happens at about 97%. 97% accuracy identifying who's really low risk. That's really great. Area under the curve, and translate these decimals into percentages. It's 78% accurate on average for identifying who's going to commit a general offense. And then it wasn't intended to predict violent offenses, but it does really, really well, 67%. What's the acceptance? You can see Seymour talks about where it's used with probationers, inmates, female offenders, Native American inmates, juvenile offenders, sex offenders. So it's used, accepted and used quite a bit. And I already mentioned it's used across the globe. The Harris psychopathy checklist. You recognize any of those guys? Who do you recognize? All of them? No. Then you're spending your time poorly.
Too many forensic files.
There you go. There you go. So let's talk about, real quickly, the psychopath. So, you know, the Harris psychopathy checklist was included in the deregistration evaluations because we can't let a psychopath deregister. I just can't imagine doing anything to take your eyes off a psychopath. So we want to identify who's psychopathic and who's not. Psychopaths occur very, very rarely. 1% or less in the general population. In a prison, they might represent 30% of who's in prison. Okay? That's pretty high, but it's still, it's not that common. I also want to, and maybe it's because I get a little pedantic on this, talk about the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. You probably think you know the difference, but I'll guarantee you, unless you think they're the same, you don't know. Okay? Around the turn of this 20th century, the term psychopath developed is to identify people without conscience, just like we're talking about here. The 1960s come, and all those mental health professionals are out there going, you know, there are no bad kids. There's just bad environments or bad society, hence sociopath, society path. That lasted about 15 years, and they said, holy cow, you can't create a kid like this, and you really can't. And sometimes the kids are coming from really good families, Menendez brothers, and sometimes they're coming from bad places too. Don't get me wrong, they can come from bad places, but trust me, it's not society creating them. So in our field, you can do whatever you want, but if I'm listening to you and you tell me he's worse than a psychopath, he's a sociopath, I'm going to think, dang, he didn't even listen to me. Because they're all psychopaths. Okay? So, there is no such thing as a sociopath if you think it's any different than a psychopath. They're one and the same. The term changed for a period of time, and now people who aren't familiar with the research like to talk about, well, he's worse than a psychopath, he's a sociopath. Or he's worse than a sociopath, he's a psychopath. They're the same. So yeah, if you want to make, his question was the difference between antisocial personality disorder and a psychopath. Antisocial personality disorder is psychopath light, okay? It's not as bad, not psychopath light. And it just is not the same. In fact, if you want to make a psychopath, this is the simplest formula I can give you. Take someone who's antisocial, okay, and by antisocial I mean two things. They break the law and they're thrill seekers. And conversely, they can't stand boredom. Boredom is painful. Like grief is painful to us. This is you can't wrap your head around this unless you really work with them. Just like if you lose a loved one, how deeply you hurt, that's how deeply boredom hurts a psychopath. They have to do something for that thrill seeking, okay? So you take one part antisocial, which is rebel, anti-authority, thrill seeker, and then you take one part narcissist. And what's the narcissist do? Doesn't respect people. The fundamental, my definition for a narcissist is really probably very, very different than yours. To me, a narcissist is someone who uses other people as a mirror. If you can reflect back to the narcissist how great he or she is, you're in. As soon as you don't reflect back to him, you say, I didn't like it when you fill in the blank, you're no longer reflecting back to them how great they are, break the mirror. Or they hurt you. Or they leave you. They go out for that pack of cigarettes and never come back. Okay? So Stan's question is, you have to add that extra element, and the narcissism is where the lack of conscience comes in. They're so important and you're not, they can do anything to you. One last quick comment. I call it cockroach mentality. When you see a cockroach running across your kitchen floor, you step on it, right? Do you stop to think, well, it could be a mother, or it could be a father. It could have baby. Do what?
Only if you're a Jane.
Only if you're a Jane? Okay. The psychopath looks at you the same way. You're a cockroach, and he's willing to step on you if you don't give him what he wants. And he has the same compassion for you that you have for the cockroach. And so that's what the psychopath is. Deregistration doesn't work. Registration doesn't work. I'm still not going to let a psychopath off. I just can't stand the concept. So we use the Hare psychopathy checklist. There's 20 items on the Hare psychopathy checklist. There's specific definitions for each one. And we just talked about grandiose a little bit with narcissism. Let me show you some of the criteria that Hare has established that they have to meet. So your definition of narcissist doesn't work. Hare's definition does. Which one did you like? Second one, during the interview with the mental health professional, he appears like he's giving a press conference. Yeah. Yeah. He's not embarrassed about his legal situation. Stan's saying some like I know in Washington. I think the key would be trying to find someone in Washington who didn't meet that. I'm not going to explain all that to you. I just wanted to show you that Hare, H-A-R-E, Robert Hare, did the research. He has really specific definitions for all 20 of the items. Here are the other 10. Look at the last 3, starting with juvenile delinquency. Juvenile delinquency, revocation of supervision, criminal versatility. Once again, the legislature asked CSOT to consider criminal history. We do that on all the risk assessment instruments. So we consider it about 3 different ways each time we're doing an assessment. I think that's really critical. I think CSOT did a good job of meeting that demand. Has the instrument been tested? Holy cow. Hare himself, over 100 studies. Has it been peer reviewed? This is a citation from another article where they found 550 articles on the Hare psychopathy checklist. It's peer reviewed.
Can somebody learn how to answer these questions so to get a good score on this test?
So it would be difficult. Let's go back. There's no questions. You start talking with them. And does he look like he's given an interview? Does he get embarrassed? Those aren't in the public domain, these kind of things, okay? So I don't think they can. They can blow smoke in an interview, but the Hare psychopathy checklist says if you have doubts, you can go for collateral information. Okay. Accuracy, one of the most accurate out there, 92% accuracy for violent recidivism. And then this is another quote from research. They consider this the gold standard of risk assessment instruments. I don't think you have to use this in most risk assessments because psychopathy is so rare, but I think we needed to use it here. Real quick comment about the deregistration evaluation specialist. There's about 500 licensed sex offender treatment providers in Texas. There's only 22. I've heard 21 and 20 estimate. Last time I checked, there was 22, but I think we may be down to 21. I think one fellow up in Wichita Falls area might have quit. All deregistration specialists are trained to conduct the evaluation in the same manner. They're going to use the same tools all the time. Good luck blowing smoke and getting through it, because you can see there's really objective criteria that has little to do with what they have to say. And there's a standardized report format. The context of the evaluation is step one, application approval. That was talked about this morning. Once they get the approval, they show up for the deregistration evaluation. When I'm done with it, I send it to CSOT. I do not give a copy. If I give a copy, and some of you have asked me to do deregistration evaluations, and I have done those for you. If I give you a copy, I put a watermark on your report that says draft. I put it in PDF, Adobe PDF, and then I lock it, I secure it. The report you have to use doesn't come from me, it has to come from CSOT. Here's just two closing comments here. Who is deregistration good for? Obviously, it's good for registrants. Their life will improve if they get off. It's probably going to be good for the general public. The registry is not working right now. If we achieve the goal of getting only high-risk offenders on there, it might work, and that would be a benefit to the public. There is no doubt that deregistration helps the family and friends of the registrants. Could it help victims? If the victim is a family member of the perpetrator, and that often happens, when the perpetrator's name goes off, any identifying information that could link it to the victim also goes off. Future victims. Right now, the registry is not working to reduce recidivism. If we have a high-risk only registry, then it might stop some future victims, might stop some reoffending. I don't know, but it might. It would help law enforcement. How would it help law enforcement? If you have fewer people, and you know we're headed towards 100,000, right? You heard the statistic earlier, we have 94,000 on there right now. We're watching 94,000 people. If we reduce it, let's say, to 10,000 or 20,000, that's fewer law enforcement officers. The ones that you can free up move from something that we know has no association with public safety. They can go do regular police work that is associated with public safety. I think that's important too. Deregistration is not enough, just some ideas to throw out to you. I'd like to see where only high-risk offenders get put on rather than doing a back end. We're not going to stop the increasing registry with deregistration. I think removing any reference to 62.4, I think was pointed out earlier, we're not in compliance with federal laws on registration. We're not going to be. It's more expensive to do registration than it is to get that money. We're never going to, unless something changes drastically. I feel like I would like to get the judiciary off the hook. Does that sound crazy? But it occurs to me, this body of elected officials called the legislature said, we don't want to get people out of the registry. We'll let this other body of elected officials do it. So they passed it to judges, and judges have to think about, what's happening, how this might affect them, their career, and things like that. What would really work, bottom line, and you can see that there, is mandatory family notification. When someone gets a sex offense, mandatorily notify everybody in that family he's a sex offender. Believe it or not, sometimes family members don't know that they have a family member who's a sex offender. Anytime that they're going to be around children, the offender, you have to make sure that the parents of those children have been trained by chaperones, or have been trained as chaperones. Okay, don't clap. Yes. Yeah. Sure. That's my recommendation. And I also think that, to be honest with you, they're struggling with that at the federal level too. You'll see information in newsletters leaking out that maybe we should be doing this, it's better. It's so politically hot. It looks like you might be soft on crime, it looks like you might be soft on sex offenders, and that's an obstacle that they haven't overcome. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I'm just about to get into that. I wasn't aware she had an influence, but I'm aware of that. Yes, ma'am. I don't know what's politically possible. I do know that if we stop putting people on unless they're high risk, that would stem the tide tremendously. I do know if there was sweeping legislation that said if you're not rated as a high risk on the current DPS levels and you're rated as medium or low and we're wiping all you people off the registry, you would then have a registry that might be functional. But I want to warn you, it hasn't been tested yet. So once you create that registry, you have to test it to see if even that's effective. Okay, so Dr. Pierce, for those of you who weren't here, yes? Millions. No. So the registration application is $50. Getting the fingerprints costs maybe $50 each. CF, DPS, and FBI fingerprints, $50. Deregistration evaluations cost $2,000, $2,500. And then attorney fees vary. And I've seen as low as $3,000, as high as $20,000. So Dr. Pierce, for those of you who weren't here, is testifying in Waxahachie. He sent me his sex offender recidivism. Let's discover what Dr. Pierce had intended to say. So, True or false? All of it's. All right, I can already preview this. Everything here is going to be false, don't you all think? Don't tell Aaron I said that, okay? Most sex offenders reoffend at some point. False. Yeah, we'll talk about the rate. Sex offenders always target. No, they don't target strangers. Aaron, what are you thinking? Sex offenders are the most dangerous type of all sex offenders? They're among the most damaging. But dangerous, some of them are dangerous. And danger, I say, takes a life. Sex offenders cannot be treated. Proper treatment reduces recidivism by 50%. The only way to keep Texas safe, put all sex offenders on public registry. Obviously, Aaron wasn't listening to my prior presentation. And the horns are on an upswing and return to total domination. I guess Aaron's an orange blood. All right, we're going to talk about recidivism, dynamic risk factors, and how these risk factors relate. Oh, I know this research. This is Langdon, 2003. He followed sex offenders and general offenders released from 15 southern states, including Texas. He followed them to find out who recidivated. You can see sex offenders recidivated over a 4-year period, 5.3 of them with a new sex offense, 68% of non-sex offenders recidivated with a non-sex offense. This is fairly typical research about sex offenders versus non-sex offenders. Yes?
For purposes of this study, is recidivism being classified as either a conviction
or return to prison? So they could go back on a technical violation. And this is by Langdon. I said I recognize, I should have let you know. Bureau of Justice Statistics reports. So this comes from the federal government. This is their study. This is the study where they talked about the unusual high rate of recidivism for sex offenders. And it was quoted in the decision that you mentioned earlier. Was it Mark Twain who said there's statistics, there's damnable statistics? What's the quote? And then there you go. Thank you. Yeah. It's amazing what you can do if you need to. The same study, the Langdon study of about 270,000 offenders, you're counting the number of sex offenses that were produced by sex offenders. You can see where it says N equals 515. Sex offenders released from the prisons committed 515 new offenses, whereas non-sex offenders, so these are going to be your POCS, your DWI, multiple, they committed 3,328 new sex offenses. So obviously, if we want to fix the registry, we have to put everybody on the registry, okay? Oh, this research I know too, the 98 and 2005, this was done by Hansen. You can see the 98 study off to the side. It talks about 23,393 sex offenders followed. It varied from anywhere from 4 or 5 years up to 20 years. The recidivism rate's 3.4%. And then he did an update to that study 7 years later. Only 19,000 sex offenders in that study. Recidivism rate's 13.7. What I'll tell you is he included people from Canada, sex offenders in Canada and Europe. Recidivism rate in the United States is much less than it is in other countries. Our justice system works a lot more efficiently. So, but let's go with those statistics, about 13.5%. Registry of sex offenders was created with the idea if we all know where the sex offenders live, we can protect our children. He's suggesting that doesn't work. Why? Well, what I talked about earlier, most sex offenses happen at home, not in public places. You would be surprised how many family members don't, even though the offenders on the registry don't know the offenders on the registry, don't know they committed a sex offense. You'd be surprised how many they do know say he didn't do it. That's where we need to tighten up. That right there is where we need to tighten up if we don't want new sex offenses. What's the impact? You know, so I'm familiar with this research too. I haven't seen that, but some authors are now saying because of the registry, if the registrant reoffends, they're less likely to report. I think that's argument. I don't know that that's I don't know that that's an empirical finding at this point. But I've seen this fairly often recently. Oh, you know what he's doing here? Let me tell you what he's doing. He's looking at, let me take a look at what the next, yeah. So real quickly, we have, you're familiar with the static 2002, like I just said. What does the word static mean to you? It means fixed, right? So those, if you look at those items on the static 2002, those are all fixed items. There's a branch of risk assessment called dynamic risk. And we do this once an offender's on supervision, we can start looking at these factors. And these 5 factors here come from a risk assessment instrument called the Stable 2007. I wouldn't use this if someone's just, like has an incident offense, they're about to be sentenced, because you can't measure some of these things like cooperation with supervision and treatment. You just can't get that data. But once they're on supervision, you can collect this data. But I think there's a reason that Dr. Pierce put this in here, because when you unpackage this risk assessment instrument and you compare it to what happens to registrants, the kind of pressure they're put under, what you're going to see is there's an overlap between the research on the negative effects of the registry and dynamic risk factors. Intimacy. We know lack of intimacy, if the person doesn't have an intimate relationship, never had an intimate relationship, had many short-term relationships, that's risky. Conflictual relationships, a person is just in a bad relationship or has hostility towards women, emotional identification with children, and lack of empathy. Hanging out with people with criminal histories, criminal lifestyle, sexual element, hanging out with deviant people, that makes sense. Or people who use illegal drugs, all that makes sense. Or social isolation. Client has difficulty making friends. As far as the impact of the registry, registrants have fewer friends. They are more socially isolated. You also have the problem of the sexual element, because family members, because of the harshness of the registry, a lot of times family members are going to deny their loved ones sexual deviance. I don't know what that is. Okay, this is the third of the dynamic risk factors. It's called general self-regulation. If they're impulsive, emotionally angry, coping skills, ineffective coping skills, and unpleasant emotions, that unfortunately I think is a lot of the guys I see. Loneliness, registry can increase loneliness. Boredom avoidance, I talked about that earlier. How antisocial people find boredom painful. Accountability, they fail to hold themselves accountable. So this is kind of the unpackaging of individuals at risk for sexual reoffense. Lawful behaviors, they have to, if they're not engaging in lawful behaviors, then what you're seeing is they're breaking supervision rules, they're limit testing, they're not invested in treatment, they lie, ask for special favor, and split treatment staff and supervision staff means they just try to play treatment against supervision. Sexual self-regulation. This is a risk factor if they're using sex to cope. Hypersexuality, sexually preoccupied, intrusive sexual thoughts, sexual arousal to children, or rape or violence. I think that's probably the most critical factor there. And then mate swapping, dominant submission, sex clubs. That may not be a risk factor for non-sex offenders, but for sex offenders, that's merely practicing having sex outside an intimate relationship. I think what Dr. Pierce is trying to communicate is that if you look at these dynamic risk factors identified completely by a different set of research, these are the same factors that are, and that's exactly where he was going. They're the same factors that get created by registration. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. Remember I told you, I quoted a different study, a 2007 study by Levinson. He has a 2005 study here. She's done a lot of research in this area. And I guess what we're looking at here is getting pulled in two different directions. Sex offenders behave completely differently after they're caught and held accountable than before they're caught and held accountable. I think that's why they have the lower reoffense rates. Remember, 70% of them aren't practiced, tried and true criminals, so they're not practiced at breaking the law. You catch them, you hold them accountable, it goes down. But the harm in the registry, it looks like that pulls them in a different direction. And Dr. Pierce would like to thank you at this point.
Our next speaker is Scott Smith. Scott, when we started putting this together, Scott called and said there are issues that are percolating and need to be addressed that tell the full picture about registration. And Matt talked to Aaron, and Matt said, let's bring in Scott to create the full picture of what's going on in the state and what Richard Gladden's doing in his litigation, so we know what's happening. And Scott's a lawyer here in Austin. He's very involved in litigation with sex offender registration, and he's one of the few people that have really taken time to study the law and the procedures. Scott?
Okay. There's a lot of ground to cover, and I probably have the most boring speech of the day because I'm going to be talking about super technical issues. And on top of that, I see that I'm the third Scott to speak, so you're probably getting tired of Scots. But I think this is probably one of the core issues in deregistration, one of the core problems right now that is contributing to this list continuing to skyrocket and be filled with low and medium risk offenders. So I wanted to talk with you about a super technical topic. Before I get started on it though, since we're going to be talking about technical, I feel like first we ought to just briefly talk about what other people have somewhat addressed, and that's at least my perspective on sex offender registration and deregistration from the human side, not something we need to go to law school for. I've represented, I've been I've been an attorney about 20 years, board certified, I can't remember. Well, an attorney for about 30, board certified for about 20. But in the last 6 years, I've devoted the majority of my time to sex offender registration issues and deregistration, hand in hand. I've met with, countless numbers of people. And this is what informs my perspective, and this is what gives me the desire to try to look at the nitty-gritty details. Because what I see happening, I think is horrible. I see people coming into my office. I can't tell you how many clients in the first interview cry when they're talking about the impact of sex offender registration, not just on them, much more frequently on their family. And even though the families are not my clients, frequently I see them as my clients because what I'm trying to do is at least as important for them. And I'm talking about wives, significant others, I'm talking about their children. And I have so many pictures in my mind of these people. I have stories from the children of registrants telling me horrible things they went through as kids, children of sex offenders. I've heard stories about them growing up in a house where their dad had to paint and put up his own sign saying a sex offender lives here. There's just countless numbers of stories. And we don't live that long in life. I mean, it's a relatively short life. And I just feel like, even we've all been to law school, or most of us here have been to law school, but I feel like it's important, at least for me, to keep my eye on the big picture of what's going on here. What are we actually doing? How are we impacting human beings' lives? And that's what my hope is through this talk and the work I do to make people's lives better. Now, I'm a defense attorney, have been most of my career. I know we have a good number of prosecutors here. Let me see hands again. How many prosecutors? Thank you. I've learned through my career to really respect what you do as just as important as what I do. I believe it. And I know you have different experiences and different horrible stories yourselves. But my hope is that we put that together because no one side is the side. And my hope is that we do our technical work in a very professional way, but we remember, what's this all about? Who is this impacting? Not just, I'm seeing my clients' families, but when I'm thinking about it in a broad sense, I'm already intuiting what Dr. Ferrara testified about the impact on society. These are really important things we're dealing with. Now, and let's see. We're going to talk about several things. Just so you have an idea, I want to talk about the origin of the tiered offense chart. Everything is going to be about tiered offense chart. Super dangerous topic. This time of day, it's very easy to fall asleep. But it is critical. The tiered offense chart is sort of like that little heat tile that was missing from the Challenger as it was descending from space. It's just a little thing. But when the Challenger descended from space and didn't have that little heat tile on it, it blew up and fell apart. And right now, I feel like a substantial part of the deregistration process is being endangered with the current tiered offense chart that we have, that I think is flawed in many ways. So we're going to talk, I think we've got to start with the origin. Where does tiered offense chart come from? I think we need then to talk about the requirements for the tiered offense chart, and then look at the problems with the tiered offense chart, and hopefully maybe talk a little bit about some possible fixes to some of these problems. I'm going to encourage anybody who has questions, has thoughts as we go through things. If I don't make sense, please raise your hand and ask the question. If I say something that you think is incorrect, please also feel free to raise your hand. Let's see. Now, I'm going to flip through the first several of these slides quickly. The first thing I wanted to show you was the CSOT white paper, a study that was conducted by the Council on Sex Offender Treatment and reduced into this white paper. And this white paper is what led to the recommendation that Texas not opt into the Adam Walsh Act for the funding. And there were a number of reasons for it that have been discussed already. But I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because some of this has already been touched upon. It talks about the research that says it's not clear at all that this sex offender registry is helping us. Talked about areas of concern. One of the big problems that they found with sex offender registration in Texas and the federal sex offender registration scheme is we're doing it on these classifications. We're affecting people's lives just based on sort of haphazard things. Does the prosecutor choose to charge this person with sexual assault, indecency by contact, indecency by exposure? Does the prosecutor choose to file one count indictment or multiple count indictments? You could have the same situation. Before focusing on sex offender registration, I've tried a number of cases. I still try cases, but I haven't seen a child pornography case with a single piece of child pornography, ever. And now most of it is internet-based. I mean, with the click of a button, you download at least 100 images like that. But if more than one of those images results in a separate count, then you've got multiple offenses. That person happens to plead guilty to more than one count. Well, suddenly that person can no longer deregister under a current scheme. Now, what sense does that make? How is that related to risk? It's not at all. It's random. It's how careful we as defense attorneys do our job. And maybe even we as prosecutors. But it's not related to the substance of what's important here, which is protecting society. The white paper, by the way, I've included that as some of the materials that you should be able to access from Dropbox. So you can read it for yourself. But it also finds exactly what Dr. Ferrara has talked about, or it expresses a concern that risk registration notification has been shown to have a destabilizing effect on low-risk offenders. That's a nice way to be saying we're running the wrong way with the ball, in the wrong direction to a certain extent, that we're actually potentially increasing risk by over-registering people. Common sense as well as research tells us when you isolate people, when you take things away from them, if you take away stable employment, stable housing, stable relationships, connection with society, you endanger society because that person becomes dangerous or more dangerous or has at least the risk of it. That person has a steeper hill to climb. I think we know when we connect people with society, they're happier, they're healthier, and they have more concern that not obeying the rules is going to take something away from them that they want to keep. The conclusions of the Council on Sex Offender Treatment and the white paper was we need to just get out of the federal scheme. We're not making money, we're losing money, and it's going in the wrong direction. Now, deregistration has sort of at its bottom of everything the base of you've got to have to be one of the criterion is that you have to register more in Texas than the federal statute. The reason for that was originally so we can keep getting funding. This is before the White study, before we made it a clear decision to opt out. So the statute was written to keep getting the federal funding before we realized that's a bad deal for us. The statute was also written to open up deregistration to as many people as possible and put it in the judge's hands to decide. Now, there's been suggestions we take it out of judges' hands altogether because they're political creatures. And you can't separate politics from law. That's reality. I get that. But right now, this is all we've got. This statute. And the design of the statute is put as many cases as we can while keeping the federal funding in the judge's hands. That's how we end up with the tiered offense chart, where we're comparing and figuring out who has more registration under Texas law than under federal law. At this point, that criterion is obsolete. It's an appendage that's no longer utilized. In fact, at this point, it's probably more harmful. Well, I don't want to hedge. It is more harmful than helpful, but it is on the books. We must apply it. But that's where it started, and it's important to remember the purpose of what it was for, so that when we're having to, as lawyers and as technicians, deal with this requirement, we at least remember the function of it. It had nothing to do with how effective we can keep the list. It only had to deal with trying to get funding, which at this point we're not seeking. Now, when we try to understand the purpose and the function of the tiered offense list, it's really important to look closely at the statute and look where are the shalls, where are the musts, and where are the mays. What's discretionary, what's mandatory. If you look closely at the deregistration statute, you're going to see, first of all, DPS must create a list. It must determine which offense requires more registration under Texas law than federal law. And then secondly, it must publish that in a list. That list is supposed to set a baseline. For these offenses, the Council on Sex Offender Treatment, and I'll refer to them as CSOT as well, must approve the application if this criteria is met and the other criteria with only one offense. The statute doesn't say that the Council can approve more than that. The Council can. It can approve for, all the Council does is say whether or not somebody can get a risk assessment and then certify that risk assessment as correct or not. The Council, at this point, is in the position of, and we're going to get to what I think is the core of the problem of number of mistakes in the tiered offense chart. But I want to right now mention that, and you already, I foreshadowed enough to let you know, I think there are a number of mistakes there. But the Council is in a position to fix this because the Council can approve other offenses if it chooses to do so, even if they're not on the list. Ultimately, the way the statute is set up is it says the judge may not approve the petition if it finds that there's more registration or not more registration required under Texas law than federal law, but the judge can correct that too. So even if we have mistakes on the tiered offense chart, between the judge and the Council, if it chooses to do so, it can fix that problem. If you look at the structure of the statute, it was set up, there's a couple of things that are interesting about it. Number one, as Dr. Ferraro already alluded to, politically, the legislature kicked the ball into the judge's hands and said, well, let the judges do it. They can lose the elections, not us. Okay. That's politics, not law, but it is what it is. But what it also did was set up so that as many of those cases as possible can get to the judges and let the judges at least make the decision. There is some, besides politics, there is a certain argument in favor of this, which is the judges sit in a position to be able to look the person in the eye and pay attention to the details of the case and make a smart decision for that particular case. That's at least the logic behind it. Another thing that the statute did was it set up this study for risk assessment, and it put a lot of focus on the risk assessment. The one thing that's got to be attached to the petition is the risk assessment. What the legislature was doing when it passed this statute was giving some guidance to trial court judges that the risk is a key thing to be considered. Now, it gave the trial courts wide discretion with the assumption that they'll get as many, that the doors will be open to them. But it shined a light on focusing on risk. Now, this is one thing that I like to discuss with prosecutors, or no, sometimes I need to, when I'm handling a deregistration case. And it should be obvious already, but to some prosecutors it's not. Registration is not supposed to be punishment. That's why, at least theoretically, the courts have decided ex post facto application of it is not a problem, because it's not punishment, theoretically. In reality, I think it is. But at least theoretically it's not supposed to be, but I've worked on cases and had prosecutors who, I mean, I've heard it more than once. Prosecutors say, well, he wants to be deregistered, and they're saying this is really hard on him. Well, he should have thought about that before he did the crime. I mean, implicitly, that is an argument, well, this is what he gets. I mean, you know, one problem obviously is, well, then you're punishing other people too, like the kids, the wife, the employers, the family. Another problem is, well, that's exactly what appellate courts have said it is not. It's not supposed to be punishment. It's supposed to be strictly protection of society. Now, the tiered offense chart, even though it makes no sense in many, to now use that as a criterion, it still is a part of the law, and we are bound to follow that. But then the question is that being followed accurately and correctly? So I want to go to the next part of my talk, which is what are the requirements of the tiered offense chart? The first thing you have to do is determine, well, what's the state duty to register? This is a super easy one. I don't think I've ever had any situation where there's been an argument over the Texas duty to register. It's pretty simple. 62.101 governs how long it is. It's just a couple brief quotes there, but it's never been an issue. It's either post-10 or it's lifetime. And since we're looking at Texas statutes and looking at the Texas requirement, there's no challenge in terms of figuring out which it is. At least none I've ever run into yet. Here's where things get a little bit more complicated. Figuring out how it applies to federal offenses. Now, federal offenses, how many people here practice in federal court? Keep your hands up, let me see. Okay. Thank you. The vast majority of us do not. Federal offenses are not parallel to Texas offenses. They don't define things the same way. They differ substantially in some very important ways. We'll talk about that in just a second. But when we're trying to figure out what's the federal registration period, we've got to somehow convert from our Texas legalese to federal language of the federal statutes. This chart here that you see is a guide for how that is to occur. As you've already heard, all federal offenses are broken down into 3 tiers: Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Tier 1 offenses require 15 years of registration at first, but can be reduced to 10 years with a clean record. Tier 2 offenses are 25 years, no reduction possible. Tier 3 offenses are for lifetime. There is a small chance of reduction of that to 25 years, but it's very infrequently applied. It applies to juvenile offenses. So you can figure pretty much if it's Tier 3, it's lifetime. Now, where the offense falls in this chart gets a little bit more complicated since we have totally different elements of offenses, totally different definitions. Texas offenses, sexual assault is a very good one to talk about because sexual assault can fall on different parts of the tiered offense chart. That's at least what I say. It's disputed by other prosecutors, some prosecutors, and there's debate over it, and there's litigation going on about it. I think I'm working on a couple cases now. I think, let's see, Seth, are you here? Seth Dennis? Okay, and Denise Nichols, are you still here? Oh, hi, nice to see you. So we're involved in a lot of debates over this right now. Denise has been my most favorite adversary. She's in Harris County, and Denise and I have been involved in a debate over exactly this point. Now, and the debate involves whether sexual assault is always a Tier 3 offense or sometimes is less than Tier 3 offense. We're going to come back to that in a second. It's important to note that one of the big distinctions between Texas law and federal laws, under federal law, an offense involving consensual sexual conduct is not a sex offense for the purposes of this chapter if the victim was an adult, unless the adult was under the custodial authority of the offender at the time, or if the victim was at least 13 years old and the offender was not more than 4 years older than the victim. For those of us in state court, well, we're also familiar with the near an age consent defense, which is basically 3 years. But the federal courts have a 4 years. And one of the interesting debates is when we're looking at federal law and deciding, well, what's the federal requirement for registration? Are we going to start applying Texas standards to determine federal convictions? I think the most important thing to consider when we're trying to do this kind of translation of state offenses to federal offenses is we need to look at the judgments, the actual judicial findings, and look at what facts were established and use that as our guide. There has been confusion. Sometimes prosecutors have not used judgments, but used offense reports as the guides in making these kind of determinations. The problem with that is offense reports are not 100% accurate, at least from a defense attorney's perspective. Even if the client's guilty, I have seen a multitude of cases where part of the offense report is wrong. We need to look at the specific facts. And the reason this becomes important is because one of the Tier 3 offenses involves sexual contact where the victim was incapable of appraising the nature of the act. Now, Texas has a law that says if there's voluntary consensual contact with somebody under 17, we're not going to allow it, period. And the presumption under that is, well, they're too young to consent. But the federal courts, their standard is 16. And separate from this statute, both in state law and federal law, there are other offenses that can be charged if somebody doesn't know what's going on. For example, in Texas law, of course, you can charge somebody with involuntary sexual contact if the person is intoxicated, not conscious. They don't know what's going on. Federal law also has that statute, which allows prosecutions, and typically from the case law I have seen, that applies I've seen it applied in a variety of cases, most frequently when somebody's intoxicated. Also, if there's what's frequently referred to as a rohypnol rape, if somebody's drugged and then the offender has sexual contact with them. I've also seen it in some cases where there's been sexual contact between medical staff and somebody in a coma. Clearly, in those cases, that person, if it's established, if the facts are established beyond a reasonable doubt, then the jury can make a determination they were incapable of appraising the nature of sexual contact. Now, in Texas, just by virtue of our statute, a 16-year-old girl, and say a 16-year-old girl who's 16 years old and 11 months cannot consent to have sex with a 20-year-old. We're not going to allow that. Is that the same thing as saying she's incapable of appraising the nature of the sexual contact? She didn't know that that physical act that they were doing was sex? From the 16-year-olds I know, they know what sex is. I have 2 kids myself. I'm sure at 16 they both knew what sex was at 16. In federal court, if you're going to get a conviction based on the incapable of appraising the nature of the contact case, you have to produce evidence of that. You can't just say, well, they're 16, they couldn't understand, or 15, they couldn't understand, or 14. There has to be some evidence of it. For example, evidence that they were in a coma. That's most likely to sustain a finding of guilt. It will certainly be upheld on appeal, and then due process is satisfied. But, okay. I don't have a lot more time to speak about this, but this is one of the key issues that's going on right now that's being debated. The tiered offense chart, let me see here. We are now on our 8th tiered offense chart since 2012. DPS has been analyzing the same laws since then with the same standard and has come up with 8 different understandings of what's going on, or 8 different charts. As an example, I want to look at March 2019 and March 2015. In March 2019, if you're charged with sexual assault, you're not eligible, period. In December of 2015, you were eligible if the victim was over 13 years of age. There's no intoxication. There's no drugging. There's no force. There's no threats. Also, if the victim was over 16 and there's voluntary sex, you were eligible as well in 2015. Now you're not, according to the new tiered offense chart. Also, back in 2015, Texas recognized that if it was within 4 years of age, you would be eligible because that would not require registration under federal law. Now the tiered offense chart says that you've got it before it. In 2015, in that situation, they said, DPS said, there's no duty to register under federal law. You're eligible. 2019, they say, they came up with the conclusion that now you must register for life. Yes, sir.
Who is applying the political pressure to create velocity changing the chart for a period of time?
I do not know. I don't understand it. I have tried to ask questions about why is this happening, and so far the only substantive conversation I've ever had on this has been with Denise Nichols, which I greatly appreciate, because at least I'm getting some answer. We don't agree. But at least we've had an intelligent conversation about it. But I have not had substantive communications about this are very limited. I did with one attorney at DPS who said, you know, you're right. And the offense chart was changed to include it. I had another conversation and said, you're wrong, but I never received the answer. Why? Denise and I have had a lengthy conversation. At least I have some theory as to what may be the argument now. As far as the politics goes behind it, I don't know. I wasn't born yesterday. I can't make guesses about things, but I do think politics affects things. But I don't really know. Yes, sir.
Have there been any challenges, or are there in Texas? I thought there were some challenges in other states to mandatory lifetime requirements for those registration, because there's no, you're not taking into account age or something like that.
I'm not. In Colorado, there's been a good decision that came out of Colorado that applied the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual, and there's been some progress there. I've heard of another decision on it as well, so there's been some headway moving forward.
Are there any challenges in Texas?
Well, we're going to get to a challenge in Texas. And I'm going to talk about that hopefully in a... Well, one of the questions is it punishment? Just because a court says it's not, you know, some courts say it's not and some courts say it is. But right, that's one of the issues. Now, real briefly, because I'm going to be pulled off the stage in a second. Here we have, I did a little review of tiered offense charts, the 8 tiered offense charts in the history of Texas. And I took a hypothetical, 2 hypotheticals, 16 and 20-year-old having, let's say, voluntary sex, where it's very mutual, very voluntary, and a 15 and a 19-year-old. Look at the results. For the 16 and 20-year-old, they were eligible under 7 out of 8 charts until the last one came out in March. Under the 15 and between the 15 and the 19-year-old, not eligible in the first 4 charts, then eligible for 2 charts, then removed for 2 charts. This is one example of inconsistency. You've got the same laws and the same analysis, but substantially different results. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss it in detail. Denise and I are going to. But that alone should give pause. Now, there are a number of other problems with the tiered offense charts, other flaws I've spotted. One that I think is a really fun and simple one is when you have a post-10 registration requirement compared with the tier 3 10 to 15 year requirement. Let's just go with 15. Well, 10 is less than 15, and so DPS says, no, not eligible. But it's post-10. What if you have 10 years of probation? You got to register for those 10 years of probation, plus 10 years after that. Even though we're all lawyers, I think we can do the math pretty quickly. That's 20 years compared with 15 years. To me, that's obviously more registration requirement under Texas law than federal law. 20 of Texas, 15 under federal. Not so on the tiered offense chart. For some reason, on the tiered offense chart, those 10 years of registration during probation don't count. Makes no sense to me. I think a huge part of the problem of the discrepancies and what doesn't make sense come from 2 things. One, that the feds allow consent at 16, not 17, and they allow a 4-year defense. The important thing to remember, let's go back to the beginning. Why are we doing this tiered offense chart in the first place? We're doing it because we have to. It makes no sense. Everybody knows it makes no sense, but the legislature hasn't gotten rid of it yet. Politics is not very friendly to improving things for sex offender registrants. So if we've got to live with it, then we got to live with it. But that doesn't mean we have to put our fingers on the scale of upping things and making it harder. That's a big part of the problem. Now, what do we do about it? Well, obviously, the best thing, in my opinion, the best thing for starters is legislature remove this reference. It would make life so much simpler. Then we don't have to argue about any of this stuff, and we can get to focusing on risk assessments, what's really important, and Denise and I could just have happy hour instead of heated debates. There are some other ways that there can be improvements. Right now, I am involved in litigation over this issue because I think the tiered offense chart is wrong in a number of ways. It's very hard to find a way to litigate this because it's not a right of appeal. But applications for writ of mandamus is the route that I'm using now, and we're working through that in Williamson County. I have my fingers crossed. We'll see how it goes. The hook pulling me off the stage is here. It's really been a lot of fun speaking with you. I would love to answer more questions. Feel free to catch me afterwards, but I've overextended my time.
We're going to start. If you have questions, we have a microphone that works, and name it who you want to ask the question, and answer the question, and then
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Cases where people have to register, right? They all say, hey, I want to leave the country. Does anybody have a list of countries that an individual can go and move to? Yeah. I know you go to the Department of State website and go country by country. I didn't know if
I'll give you a link to that.
I have a client who moved to Costa Rica when he got off probation, and he doesn't have to register in Costa Rica.
Yeah, in answer to Dave's question, there is a non-lawyer that has accumulated, has a website that has just about every country.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
eligibility for deregistration, you like to year the offense or to current form of charge?
Here, Scott? Scott, the question is, does the ability to deregister depend on the current chart or an old chart?
Correct, current chart. And I can at least explain, at least more likely than not, what the reason why the chart has changed most recently is yes, there's a smart office, and in their interpretation of federal law, they're the ones that are responsible for that. And considering it is the link of duty for registration required under federal law, that is the federal jurisdiction to make that determination how effective law is under their regime. More likely than not, that is actually why the office is trying to change the way that.
Any other questions?
Just one of the public working at UPS, do they still have to register the case itself? But the board is part of the requirement.
If a case is dismissed, then they're not convicted. Richard Gladden has a breach of contract lawsuit pending in federal court right now, where the issue is, person gets probation, is told he has to register up until the term of until his probation is over with, based on 1993 law. Law changes in '97. Is that a breach of contract, and he's entitled to relief? And if I may add, what Richard's talking about is a law in effect in 1993. And what we have is many people who pled guilty, pled no contest, got placed on deferred prior to anybody having a registered sex offender in the 80s or even going back into the 70s. Who now have to register, who have pled guilty, and when it wasn't even the law. So, any other questions? No. Yes, Denise. Matt.
Placebos. Anyway, is it working? Can you hear me now? Okay. So let's say John Doe gets a risk assessment and he's high on the static. He goes again and he's smiling bigger this time, but we still look at the criminal history. And you saw, if it's the matrix, 6 of the 7 items go from criminal history. If it's the LSIR and that's what was high, if he changes his life, that may bring it down. But if it doesn't change his life, that doesn't bring it down. So there's things that are built in that are safeguards against that. But I like what you're saying. I wish they would keep it, not only the fact that he's applied, but what his score was, because that could possibly stop someone from manipulating the system. If we can think of it, they can think of it. Oh yeah, I have to, by law. And by the way, so does everybody else. If they're LSOTP, they have to keep it. It does. No, you don't. If you, yeah. Yes, it is. But they're not keeping a copy, which is what, was that your question? And that was your concern, is they might not keep the question, and they would come back and then shine their shoes better, try for another person, and then have another different report sent.
told you, you know, be regulated. If I stay regulated,